Hello, my name is Mark Lanza, and I'm the president of the Motion Picture Sound Editors. Welcome to our Sound Device event for February 17th, 2022. Cinematic sound design for web content with sound designer Kevin Senzaki. All of our past events are available on our YouTube channel for viewing. We also have more sound device events coming up, so please check your email and the MPSE Facebook page for more details. Our quarterly magazine was recently shipped to our members. To see the latest edition of our quarterly newsletter, please go to mpse.org. Please remember our Golden Reel Awards are coming up very soon, March 13th. Tickets are on sale now, again at mpse.org. You can also see our MPSE merchandise line, and if you're not yet a member, you can get a list of requirements and fill out an application. I'd like to thank all the students who are here today to watch this, and now I would like to introduce our MPSE Board of Directors member, Eric Marks. He's the chairman of our Sound Device Events panel, and he set up tonight's event. Eric, thank you so much, and it's all yours.
Thank you, Mark. Our guest tonight is a truly one-of-a-kind supervising sound editor and sound designer. He started his career in 2010 as the lead sound person on all of Rocket Jump's YouTube videos, where each of his projects were regularly viewed by over 7 million viewers. He was also the supervising sound editor for 3 seasons of Video Game High School, for which each episode generated over 10 million unique views, as well as Anime Crimes Division, Dimension 404, Rocket Jump the Show on Hulu as well. In total, he has supervised over 150 short films, and his projects have totaled 1.5 billion views. He was one of the heads of Rocket Jump Film School as well, a group that created online filmmaking tutorials for up-and-coming filmmakers worldwide. And his work, in addition to all that, has been nominated for 2 MPSE Golden Reel Awards. Please join me in welcoming Kevin Senzaki. How are you doing tonight, Kevin?
Oh, pretty good. How about you?
I'm good. I'm really glad you could be with us. So, Kevin, we met at USC in the School of Cinematic Arts in the late 2000s. And I think there are a few items about your career that stand out as really unique about your path. The first thing is that you worked for a long time as the lone sound person, the only person on a sound team on your projects. The second thing is that you're almost entirely self-trained. And the third thing is that the timing of the beginning of your career lined up with a really interesting time in YouTube, with YouTube and web videos and non-union work just in general. So going back all the way back to when you graduated film school, the industry and the economy are in a much different place, obviously, than today, and YouTube was taking off. How did this perfect storm influence your early career choices and opportunities that came your way?
Yeah, right when I got out of film school, it was not the best job market. The housing market just crashed in 08. I graduated in 2009, and I didn't really have. I had the benefit of already being in Los Angeles, but there wasn't really a specific major studio or place, post house that I really wanted to chase. So I kind of just went around and wanted to experiment and try things. And the benefit of having gone to USC for film school is, knowing a lot of like-minded people, who have similar, ambitions to break into the industry at an unusual time. A lot of web content is what came up. A lot of, companies looking to get, ads made for the internet were hiring. So that was kind of how I initially found traction sort of with my classmates.
That's great. And like, as you're coming out of school, like I obviously knew you at the time, but like, what were some of your long-term goals? Like, did you know at that point you wanted to focus on sound, or what were you like hoping to do long-term?
Yeah, I did. I was one of those people who kind of stumbled into college and film school knowing that I like a bunch of aspects of this. I liked picture editing. I liked, working with cameras. I liked sound. But by then I decided I was pretty much ready to commit to doing sound work, because it was something I genuinely enjoyed, and people thought I was apparently good enough at it. So I pretty comfortably eased into, trying to get a Pro Tools set up at home, which was a little bit more of an ordeal back then. Got one of the O2 DigiDesign boards, that needed FireWire, and decided to just go for it.
That's great. Well, with all this in mind, just the early parts of your career coming right out of school, I think we should jump to an example of some of your work back then, a short film that you worked on pretty early on after school for you, after graduating. So I'm going to share my screen. We'll play a sequence from one of your early short films. This one is called London Brawling.
Oh, no, guys!
Yeah, pretty crazy action-packed short film. The main release for this was on the web, right, Kevin?
Yeah, that was a weekly YouTube video.
Yeah,
and
so-
if it, yeah, and just to give the context, if anyone here was like, that seems kind of like Kingsman, that was a sort of sponsored short film. That was a bit of a tie-in, which is why there's a strange magic umbrella.
I love it. So you're working on these once a week. What does a schedule look like on a project like this for you?
Yeah, so I joined up with a YouTube channel that was called Freddie W at the time, and they had already had some momentum. They were a bunch of USC grads from the year before I got out, and then I ended up kind of hooking up with them. But since the turnarounds were really quick, for at least a good couple of years, they would have 1 week, a new video would come out. So that would be 1 week to go from pre-production through post. So that typically meant about 48 to 72 hours for post sound, and that was from an assembly cut, with VFX coming in to release. So, when you're put in that sort of situation, you sort of triage it, and you're like, well, how do we get something that's gonna, seem like it was done properly, even though we don't really have much time? So I would sort of go through this process of mixing as I was editing. And then, and you had reminded me, Eric, I had a template set up then with, mono effects tracks. I had a bunch of stereo tracks that were panned in 50-50 to kind of glue stuff to the screen, and then full wide stereo tracks. So I would just start dropping in what I felt were the most important effects usually, because they're usually so action driven, and then kind of mix everything just as I'm starting to really bare bones assemble it. So there was really no distinction between like a dialogue editing phase, an effects editing phase, and a mixing phase. It was just sort of going head to tail, doing everything at once. And what was really kind of nice about that is you could really build towards the result. It wasn't sort of in the abstract focusing on just one thing, like, oh, if we suddenly need Foley, I'll just plug a microphone into, I was on a $700 Toshiba laptop at that time. I just, plug in a mic and record the Foley, or, do some efforts. Like, I think about half the screams in that clip we showed were me dubbing in some, fight efforts. Cause like, who else are you going to get? We have, a day left. So it was this really fluid process of just trying to distill, in this case, like kind of a goofy martial arts scene down to elements that you can achieve in that time period. And then every week it would sort of be a different theme. It'd be a different genre. So it became a thing of just really trying to understand a lot of, I don't want to say cliches, but a lot of the sort of sonic signatures of different genres, and then figuring out how to channel that. So, because for a lot of the stuff, I was pretty much the sound department. I didn't really have a conventional mentor for a lot of this. So I would turn to YouTube and oftentimes just, watch through a bunch of scenes from films that I liked, or look up new ones. and try to, pick apart, like, what are they doing stylistically that I think would be, good reference or whatever. And it's fun when you're doing stuff under, tight turnaround with other people who are film nerds too, because they'll often point you at, at something and be like, oh, hey, we're going for this vibe. It's like, okay, I think I know what's going on.
So when you say film, the other film nerds, are those people like on your project, or are they just other people out in the industry that you kind of are asking for advice from? Like, were you surrounded by film nerds on these projects as you're working?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the YouTube crew was, probably roughly 10 people, with a lot of other talent that would come in and out. That specific scene was actually, the fight choreography was done by a friend of ours named Young, who recently did Shang-Chi. So he's moved on to slightly more expensive things, but there's a lot of people who are just really enthusiastic, and wanted to do everything. So every week they would do something different. And in terms of where we were at that time, that's right when a lot of technology was becoming relatively more affordable. That's, right when digital cameras were becoming good enough. And that's right when, the software was getting good enough where people could just do visual effects shots on their laptops. And that kind of, that technology becoming accessible and YouTube being a platform, I think just led to a bunch of, frustrated people trying to break into the industry who were in LA, just deciding, well, we'll just do this for fun. And then it picked up momentum. That's
amazing. So, I mean, there's a lot of content to cut. I mean, you're in charge of dialogue, you're in charge of Foley, ADR, sounds like, but effects in particular. I mean, there's so much here, and there's a lot of material to cut. How in the process of like your schedule, your post schedule on these projects, like when did timing lock or picture lock happen, and how did that sort of affect the way that you worked?
Yeah, it would. I mean, the picture could always change, but the nice thing is you're usually looking at a 5-minute sequence, and those conforms are usually survivable. And a lot of that stuff, because it was so quick, they would shoot for the edit. So it was, handles would shift, but it was never too catastrophic. I think if there was any more freedom editorially, I don't think that would have been achievable.
And like you mentioned, like visual effects. So like, how early on would you see any sort of like rough visual effects or any sort of stuff that could help you with timing of your sounds while the rough cuts are going, coming your way?
Yeah, what was nice is a lot of the people that were pretty keen on visual effects. So to be quite honest, I got better treatment from them than I have on more quote unquote legitimate projects, because from the very first cut, they would just put in, squares on the frames where things were supposed to happen. So I would at least have, timing indicators. And, if things drift at a frame or two, that's not a big deal. That usually gives you enough so you can actually, build a cue at least.
That's great. And then, so like, this is you have a week to work on a project like this. What were your typical work hours like? Are you working nights, weekends, just kind of around the clock to hit a deadline, or like, what did your schedule look like?
It was pretty long hours. I mean, back then I didn't have, kids or anything. So I was on a very late schedule. I'd usually, work until 3 a.m. or whatever. And then if I was lucky enough to catch up to where visual effects were, then I'd, just stop, obviously.
And so you're working on this like pretty intense content over and over, like once a week, really quick turnarounds, a lot of stuff that you're cutting every week. And they're each getting released online. Like how would you say this sort of like process of working on things so quickly helped you grow as a sound editor early in your career?
Yeah, I think it probably has affected me in ways I don't even understand, but just as a creative person in general, whether it's, sound or other things, I tend to be a sort of impulsive press buttons and see what happens person. And then after a while, I'll step back and intellectualize it and be like, okay, well, this isn't working. Then I'll go, read up about it. But for me, like all the decisions tend to happen really quickly. Once I've made up my mind, I just like to go and do a bunch of things. And this was sort of a insane pressure cooker environment that really encouraged leaning into that. So I would imagine even now, I'm sure that's affected the sort of pacing that I operate at.
So this is like a Freddie W / Rocket Jump project, and you're on this sort of weekly timeline. What sorts of other work were you getting during this time? Like any other types of projects, and like how were you getting the word out about your work at the time?
Yeah, at the time, well, I was very fortunate because my parents live in Los Angeles, so I had the very nice situation of being able to focus on pursuing sound work and not having to worry too much about paying rent specifically, because they let me just sort of hang out like a degenerate in their house for a little while. So once that really kind of picked up and the work was consistent, and it didn't pay poorly per se, but I wanted to really just focus on pursuing that, because at the time YouTube was a platform that no one really knew it was going to grow into. We did have an audience. There were millions of people a week checking out the content, and everyone was kind of excited to see what would happen next. So I did miscellaneous other jobs, but once that kind of picked up, I really honed in on that. And I think it's worth mentioning for the audience to kind of give context. The other big thing that the Frey W channel did at the time was kind of some of the first like narrative web series. They did a show called Video Game High School that basically predicted esports. Like it was this, at the time, this dumb, it's still dumb, but this, escapist fantasy about kids who are really good at video games. So they go to this high school to play them to become professionals. And that was not a real thing at the time. Like it has since happened. And just to get the details correct, on that show specifically, I was an effects editor. Paul Fonarev, who's hanging out, I think, was the actual supervising sound editor, just to clarify that one. But that, by the time they started to do that, they already had a pretty good YouTube audience. So that first season of Video Game High School, they partially crowdfunded on Kickstarter, and they raised, I believe, $250,000, which at the time I think was a record. And then for the subsequent seasons, they did other crowdfunding on top of other funding, and I think they got close to $1 million each time as well. And this was like that was pretty big for that time. That was a new thing.
Wow. And like how for that, like a series like that, how long were the episodes and how many episodes per season?
Yeah, the first season of the show was basically a feature that got broken up into little parts. I believe the episodes were pretty short. They were like 10 minutes, give or take. And then they turned it into more like a TV series proper. They got closer to half hour or longer episodes as it went on.
Very nice. And just last thing before we get to the next video, I just wanted to double check. You said around this time in your career, you didn't really have any mentors or someone you were like looking up to as sort of like a North Star for you, or anyone you could lean on for advice? Were you just figuring all this out pretty much on your own?
Yeah, I don't want to say that in a way that may sound arrogant, but because I was largely working by myself, I would of course talk to people. I'd ask people things, and I would try to self-educate. Don't want to turn this into a huge sidetrack, but when I was kind of getting ready to do this talk, I was kind of thinking about like, where did I get started? And I realized when I was a young kid, the two movies that really made me go, wow, movies are really cool. They're not very interesting choices, but it was Star Wars and Jurassic Park. But I realized it's because when I got Star Wars in VHS, I also got the making of Star Wars. And then my parents taped the making of Jurassic Park when it aired on TV. And then I realized, I think even from the beginning, I was more interested in the making of part than the actual movies, even though they're very good movies. So I think I always was kind of interested in trying to figure out how things were done, and being put in this situation where people are expecting you to produce results and you're like, oh, I got to figure out how to do this. Like, I think I actually kind of thrived on that, instead of it being more of a conventional process where there was someone who in theory would hold all the answers for me. I kind of liked having to figure it out. And
that's really interesting.
Yeah, and going back, I'm not too embarrassed of the work I did at that point in my career. If anything, it's more just cringing at the Pro Tools session organization, because no one else ever had to see it. It was like there's no ad tracks for things I did later. It's just it's all I was
going to say, and they still don't have to see it. I mean, they still don't have to see your sessions. But yeah, that's
fair enough. Yeah,
it's probably a good sign that that you're still, to this day, you can look back and still be proud of like the early work as you were figuring things out and getting to where you are.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the good thing is the biggest cringe I have is like, oh, I really could have used RX on that one. But
yeah, I mean, technology has evolved so much, even like from that time till now. It's a whole different conversation, probably. Okay, well, let's go to another video example of some of your work. Full disclosure, I worked with you on this project, but you were in charge of all sound editing on this project. So this is a three-part film, or three or four?
I think it's four. Yeah, it was released as four.
So this is for, this was like a web component, like web series spinoff of Ubisoft's game, The Division. And we're going to show a segment from Escape, which is one of the 4 shorts.
Conserve ammo.
Copy.
Holding. On me. 3, 2. Yeah, suppress the fire.
Make a move!
So another, really intense, pretty dense wall-to-wall sound effects driven sequence. And I was lucky to just kind of see your work as it was actually happening on this one back in the day. But what I really wanted to focus on here with this was, I know you have a pretty unique approach to creating gunshots and sound effects when there are multiple variations of a sound that are needed, especially with like multiple perspectives, distances. And I think back then I was probably working in game audio, so I think I was extra interested in this approach of yours. But how did you come up with this approach to creating like variations of sounds when you have like this amount of sounds necessary and you need to kind of vary them up and have just tons and tons of material to use that you've built yourself?
Yeah, I mean, with something like that, I think it's kind of just identifying how many distinct voices you would need, or how many different firearms there are. And I think for some of those, I had stuff with different perspectives that were already, sort of printed out that I had done for other projects that I thought still would stylistically fit. But, in general, it's just coloring your effects tracks different colors and grouping them out. And then, obviously the cumbersome aspect of that is when someone like, you have to, mix the stuff I put together, you're getting 40 different gunshot tracks, and each gun is like 6 layers, and it's like, what's going on? But the nice thing for that is when you have to turn around the perspectives really quickly, there's discrete elements that you can basically just, bring up and down to kind of achieve a, simulation of that. I think what really helps glue that bit together, other than it just being so loud the whole time, is they specifically asked for us to try to capture the feeling of like Michael Mann's Heat, which, is famous for its gunshots, which were, a lot of that was, production audio recordings of, blanks being fired in downtown LA. In this case, it was all CG muzzle flashes. They were a little ahead of the curve on that. So there was no production sound. So I remember it's a lot of like thunder rumbles and cannon shots that are cut as a separate effects group that I think I gave to you and just said put Altiverb on it and hope it works.
Yeah.
But I think with something like that, the volume isn't really so much what's intimidating. It's just coming up with each kind of identifying each discrete element that you're going to need, and then once you have that, it's easy enough to replicate it, to tweak it for different shots, to randomly pitch shift certain variations so it doesn't sound too repetitive. And then for something like that, I'll usually work through from the gunshots as the starting point, and then bullet impacts after that, and then bullet zips and buys after that. Because something like that, when people see the flash on screen, that's going to dictate the timing. And then you get a little more leeway on most of the hits, and you need to space them enough so you can feel them. I think that's kind of the big lie with every gunfight ever. Like the bullets are moving way too slow, but otherwise it wouldn't do anything in terms of storytelling. So, yeah,
I think one of the things, like watching you work on this, I think this was like 2015 or so. I was just seeing how, like you mentioned, that the CGI gun flashes, like muzzle flashes and things like that, that were pretty new for this type of medium. Like you being able to keep up with the conform of that was incredibly impressive. Like, because those kept moving. I mean, there was no like timing lock, as you said earlier. Like they kept moving, and I was just so in awe of how you were able to keep things like up to date with picture as things were going. Like, was that a pretty regular thing for you on these sorts of projects?
I think so. And I think I'm just honestly a bit irritable. So I'll just go through and just like, oh, that's off. And I'll just fix it. Like in the final one, there's a bullet hit there on screen that they added after we delivered the mix. So there's no sound effect for it. It's one bullet hit. And it bothers me. It's like, I still notice it. But
But let's say they weren't gunshots. So like, let's say it wasn't something that you'd previously created. Like, let's say this was some sort of unique weapon that's not realistic or something. You sort of have a system how you create a sound and then variations of it, right? And the way you like organize that in your Pro Tools session. Could you like speak a little bit to like how you created that?
Yeah, I don't think it's so much a formal process, but sort of the way my brain works, is I'll sort of look at it and then make dumb mouth noises or whatever, but there'll just sort of be a sense of, I think this is kind of the direction it wants to go. And then what I'll usually try to do is just think of something that I've already have, recorded or, can record or create or have, my library, just a single element of that, whatever, like say if it's a big sci-fi weapon, that's going to be, this broad spectrum, big sound effect, this, huge event. It's like, just what is a piece of that that I can latch on to? And then I'll try to identify what that piece is. And it may, doesn't matter what it is. If it's a synth thing, a dry ice squeal or something, an animal sound. But I'll plop that in. And of course it sounds terrible. It's not what you want. But then I'll start building out from whatever that single element is to fill in the deficiencies. So, right away, if I've picked, something that's in the high end, it'll just be finding a low end that'll, complement that. And then it's like, okay, we got to build out the tail on this. And then it's just sort of iterating on that until I have way too many layers, but it's getting pretty close. And then, it becomes a bit of subtractive work at that point.
And you're sort of laying them all next to each other on a timeline, right? Like not necessarily anywhere near the QuickTime and a Pro Tools session, but you're like, I've just seen the way you kind of lay them out one after the other, and it's really efficient and just something I hadn't thought of before I saw you do it.
Yeah, I mean, if there's, if I'm lucky enough to have reference, I'll usually build sort of a prototype wherever it's going to actually play, and then I'll take it out, beyond the end of picture and iterate on it if I need to do, variations. If it makes sense at that point to actually just kind of pre-build, and have all the variations strung out.
Yeah, like I imagine that there was that video you worked on more recently that was like where you had to create your own unique lightsaber sounds. I imagine it was something like that for you, where like you created a sound and then you created variations right after it and laid them all out in your timeline. Is that kind of how you did that?
Yeah, it was a little more chaotic, where after the end of the picture, I just strung out all the discrete elements that I thought would be useful. And then I would kind of go through and do a pass. Okay, this is going to be all the spark hits. And then I would cut all those in for the whole thing. And then I would go back out to, all the elements I pulled. I'm like, all right, we're going to try one of, these flame whooshes. And then if it worked for one cue, I'd go through and kind of string them out. So, in retrospect, I think what you're proposing is much smarter, but I was sort of dumbly, naively building, hundreds of repetitive hits individually each time. but I think at the same time, when you have something that's so repetitive like gunshots or weapon hits, you really kind of score it more like music in a way where I think I find pre-building it too much to be a bit limiting, where it's like I can't quite get a variation in there. I want to feel a little more intensity on this hit. I want to have this one a little more aggressive or whatever. And that's not necessarily the tactic I would universally recommend, but for the way my brain works, I think I find that more manageable.
Going back to this sequence, so there are obviously just a ton of different sound effects needed for each type of sound. So what sort of helped you stay efficient? Like, how are you able to work quickly when you have this volume of sounds to cover?
Yeah, I think it's honestly just kind of approaching the sequence from head to tails in this case, because there really aren't any breaks. And it's just dropping a memory location 1 minute in and being like, all right, that's my goal. I have to hit that memory location by dinner, and you just sort of go for it. And I think a lot of it is blocking out the stuff you're committed to doing. Like if you see a weapon on screen, you're probably going to have to hear it. And then it's blocking all that in. And then I think if you hit a groove with that can move pretty quickly. And then it's, if you're fortunate to have more time, then you're really adding more shot by shot unique elements that enhance it and make it a little more interesting.
And like earlier in your career, let's say like before even this project, what were some of like your go-to plugins that you would use while creating in order to help you create unique sound effects?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, to be honest, I largely lived out of using the default Pro Tools plugins, by and large. I tend to, even today, I'm pretty light on plugins. I'll use, obviously, pitch shifting, Doppler effects, pretty basic distortion and, reverb EQ, the real standard stuff. But my approach tends to be more mutating and layering elements together. So I think especially at that point, plugins were less on the, from scratch creation side and more of on the worldizing side. It was a lot more EQing things to fit the perspective, adding reverb to put things in the right space more often than not. Mm-hmm.
I'm sure if you were turning most of these over to a mixer, they would appreciate that, but you were mixing most of these yourself too.
Yeah.
So let's say you had a project like this on your plate, the Division, and you also were doubling up, like let's say you had a short from Rocket Jump or Corridor Digital or one of these companies, and they're going at the same time. How did you go about like splitting up your time and prioritizing when you had multiple things going at once?
Yeah, I mean that's I think just kind of the standard classic freelance thing of like, well, I'm juggling half a dozen things and everyone needs stuff on certain dates, but I would just kind of usually start a day jumping into whatever interested me the most. And then as soon as I kind of hit a lull, or as soon as my brains would start to wander, I would just jump over to a different project. And then just kind of hop back and forth, multiple times a day until everything kind of got in the right place.
Did any of this, like when you're juggling multiple, like do you feel like you had to have any sort of established communication set up with your clients ahead of time of like, hey, I'm going to need a few days, or I have other things going on, or like I'm going to need a few days before you even can review some of my work, or like are lots of them like sort of breathing down your neck waiting for something while you're trying to balance projects?
Yeah, I mean, every client's different, obviously, but the thing I found really nice, and I was really fortunate to have with a lot of these groups doing the YouTube content, is we got along well creatively, and there was sort of a mutual respect for what everyone was doing, and people were all throughout the process kind of given space to have opinions about things. And a lot of what I found rewarding about it is 90% of the ideas I would just throw at the wall, without getting approval, would usually stick. So, we would of course set a deadline for, first review or whatever, but it was typically just send over what you got, and we would kind of, go from there. Or if I knew I was kind of in a space where I would have to come up with something, then I would just do, like a minute and just send it out as soon as I could. And then, wait to get feedback.
That's great. Okay, I'd like to go to one last example of your work so people can get a sense of this kind. So we're going to jump to a short of yours called Anime Self-Driving Cars. I think what's great about this is like, it's incredibly obvious, at least to me, that none of these could have been pulled, these sounds that you use could have been pulled from a library. You had to be incredibly original and create a lot of these sounds from scratch. Like you're not taking traditional sounds. So I think this will be a good example of your creations and how much you had to do and create within a short period of time.
The Speedtron has one fatal flaw. Gotta be smart to go fast, not the other way around. Activate overclock level 1.
Chaos Mason isn't in his car! He's breaking the rules!
He's breaking the rules?
Z, are you there?
Oh no, my phone!
Angela to Z! Z,
I got it!
the finish line is coming up, and he's going to beat you. You have to go faster!
It's a hard video to explain even in context.
So obviously, like a ton of outside the box sounds that you had to create for this one. That essentially, I imagine you had to create from scratch. What was your process like on this project?
Yeah, there's that one was relatively generous. I think we had about 5 days, and that was just because the CG took them so long to do. The latter half of that does have a bunch of material I recorded. That particular chunk, I think, is still mostly library, but it's sort of a more extreme version of what we did on like the Division, where the element I knew that we would have to glue that together were car engines, at least some element of that. So I think the first thing I did was I just cut the cars like a conventional racing scene, even though that wasn't giving us narratively in terms of tone what we needed. And then it was building things on top of that that would get it to 1,000%, to get it to be a little more ridiculous. So and of course it's different shot by shot, but I think the general idea is there's synth layers under all the cars too, and there's like a different synth tone for each of them. And then I believe they are pitching up in every single shot, so it's sort of this aggressive shepherd tone approach to it. Because I don't think there's any other way to do something that silly. It just has to always be, like that bit where, like the bit where the guy drops the phone. His scream is pitching up the entire time. It's the scream is looped like half a dozen times, I think, to get it long enough. But
how about like these super specialized sounds, like UI stuff for the car, or like I think it was like the brake or something on the wheel of the car. Like, how did you go about building like those sorts of really unique sounds?
Yeah, I think on there, because it was so quick, it was a lot of just working from different UI libraries. But I think it's really just knowing what you're going for in terms of tone, because there is such a that risk of just having your beeps and boops not really matter. That's a weird specific thing that drives me nuts. It's just in anything where like a UI sound doesn't quite fit that world. And thank you for thinking that those might have been original synthesized. I just don't think I would have had the time to have done it there. But it's a lot of, I think, just really keeping in mind what the precise tone is, even if it's kind of elusive if you haven't quite, manifested it yet. and it's just being, selective.
I have a few more questions, but if anyone here has questions for Kevin, you can feel free to start adding them with the chat, and we can sprinkle those in as well. We're going to have plenty of time for questions if anyone has any. By this point in your career, I think YouTube and web shorts are kind of in a much different place than when you started, when you first got out of school. So how did that affect the types of projects that are coming your way at the point when you're making something like this?
Yeah, it reached this point where it was, getting pretty elaborate. Obviously, like that last video you saw had a lot of full CG shots. And it's for an internet video, that's kind of getting a little crazy. But it was a diverse group of people making the content, and they all had pretty different interests. So, some people went on to do features, some people stayed on the web, but my connections through that network all kind of maintained. So I've kind of gotten dragged with everybody in a bunch of different directions. So, YouTube eventually started to change, and the ad revenue no longer really became sustainable for, throwing that kind of budget at a short film. The work I started doing just sort of naturally diversified as the people I collaborate with kind of experimented with different things. So it's gone all over the place. I've done documentaries, I've done, features, video game stuff, it's, kind of whatever. And I like that, where the challenge is always changing. In a way, it's sort of just a bigger version of a weekly YouTube video. Every time it's something different. I feel like I'm not quite qualified to do it, but makes it fun.
I think that's really cool. I'm looking back now on your career and just sort of like the unique role that you developed for yourself on these early videos. What do you think like bigger projects can benefit from that you found vital to your way of working on these projects?
Yeah, I think the pro and con, in my subjective personal experience working on, quote unquote bigger projects, and by that meaning where, I am not doing everything myself. The nice thing is there's more checks and balances, and there's some sanity to, the typical structure this industry functions on. I think that makes sense. But when I'm working on a project like that, I'm typically, the effects editor or something. And I do in a way feel certain frustrations that I'm not mixing, everything, that I'm delivering something that's going to be handed off to someone else. But I think I still, approach it where I'm trying to make a lot of these decisions in terms of what the tone is going to be, and I try to find that really quickly, so I can sort of, put something together, communicate that to the rest of the team, be like, hey, is this what we like? Yes or no?
Because I imagine there are a lot more moving parts when you're like a cog in the machine, as opposed to like running a whole department and answering only to yourself on these projects where you're just in charge of everything for sound, right? And maybe your role on some of these early projects was even bigger than just sound.
Yeah, I don't want to give too many hints, but you show up in some of these YouTube videos, and there was one occasion where for a web series, I got the script a week before we were going to shoot, and there was a character named Senzaki in the script who was like the throwaway bad guy at the beginning of a Bond movie. And I just texted the director, like, am I supposed to be in this? He's like, yeah, I guess. I was like, I guess. And that was the first scene we shot for the series, and I'm in it. I had lines, and I was also doing production audio. So I was like, well, how's this going to work? So I grabbed the PA and I was like, look, you'll be fine. I can ADR it later if I need to. So
starting to get some questions from everyone, and please keep them coming, everyone. Great questions already. Juan asks, do you have some tips for creating anime sounds? Sounds like powers or power-ups?
Ooh, yeah, that's a tricky one, because a lot of the classic anime sounds, they're done on like older synths. And to be completely honest, there are some pretty good independent libraries out now where people have dug up, that kind of hardware and batched it out. And that's, I think, always a good starting point. But other than that, a lot of it is just kind of looking for really unusually tonal elements. I think there's a lot of, sort of things you can do with relatively pure tones. And then with a bit of, compression EQ, you can get it to sound a little more vintage. But there's a lot of just weird warbly, synthesizer like tones, and I think it's gravitating towards that. And then again, I think because I came from that background working so quickly, I do really enjoy going out recording large batches of raw material I can work with. But a lot of times I think I know my library so well too. It's a lot of, if I need a really specific affectation to the sound like that, I'll just go for stuff that I know was recorded in like the 70s and already has some kind of lo-fi quality to it, and then it's building from those elements already have that color.
Very cool. Yeah, when you first started talking about the old synth machines that don't exist anymore, it reminded me of when they were creating the soundtrack, the music side for Blade Runner 2049, and they had Hans Zimmer and company had to find the types of synth instruments that Vangelis used on the first Blade Runner, which was really cool too. We have a question from Sharon. Kevin, do you find yourself recording sounds? You kind of already answered this, but if you can go further, maybe. Do you go record sounds that you don't hear necessarily for one particular project, but you might find interesting for a future project, or that inspires you when you're just out and about?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm always a little bit angry at myself for not carrying better quality recording equipment, but I've definitely gotten useful stuff on phone voice memos, honestly. And especially these days when you're watching a couple of kids during a pandemic, you don't really have room in your bag to carry, proper gear. But yeah, absolutely. Whenever I have the opportunity in a schedule to go and, do actual recording sessions for a project, it'll sort of be, what else in this room can we use kind of thing. And I found, at least in general, when I'm at the point where I'm building a library out for a specific project, I don't quite know what's going to be usable. But, I think when you're there, it's very easy to remember everything. So I've found I get a lot of mileage out of stuff I recorded, years ago, and it's never being used for what it was intended for. But, there was, a day where I recorded with just, someone else's filing cabinet, a bunch of dry ice, and that gets used in everything I do. Like in the anime car race, a lot of the cars under stress, it's just, a filing cabinet. But yeah, I'm always trying to find, the opportunity to build out little goofy recordings like that.
That's amazing. What was that? I'm trying to remember. You had a microphone years ago. I don't know if you used this for sound effects recording, but I remember you had a mic at your house that if you wanted to record something, you had to shout right into the mic. It was like,
oh yeah. Yeah, I tried to do my due diligence and Google it and figure out what it was, but it was some kind of old, I think, we never quite figured out what it was originally for, but it was an absolute potato microphone. And I've ended up using it as a microphone for sci-fi gas mask voices, where I'll just shout stuff into that and then have it coming out through a guitar amp or something. And it gives you this absolutely wonderful, borderline unusable sound.
That's great. We had kind of a broad question from Autumn. How do you go about building your sound library, just in general?
Yeah. So right when I got out, I started getting into sound work. I got a relatively cheap computer. I didn't really buy a lot of plugins. I threw the majority of my money at just trying to get a decent sound library. And then from that, a lot of my early work was just getting familiar with the assets in there and then recording material as needed when there were things that just wouldn't cover. So a lot of the stuff that I've recorded that I get tons of mileage out of, it's not the most glamorous stuff, but I am always angry at canned Foley footsteps. And when there isn't time to record stuff, I'm still using stuff we did for Video Game High School because I prefer the sound of a lot of our concrete and dirt footsteps. It was me and Paul, we were just hanging out at USC, I think. But it's just they sell, so I'll still use those. And so it's a lot of just these miscellaneous things. I haven't done a really good job of building a full coherent original library in terms of just the real standards, but it's this growing mass of odds and ends that end up being useful.
Another question from Sharon. Do you have a sound that you put in every show as a hidden signature? Maybe like a
I do.
thing?
Yes, I do, and I am ashamed that I didn't record it originally, but there is a video on YouTube of a sheep screaming like a human. I think it's 7 seconds long. I'm not even sure if it's a sheep, it might be a goat. But it does a very human-like scream that I think is funnier than the Wilhelm. And as much as I love it, I will put myself on the line and say I think the Wilhelm is overused. That might be a generational thing, but my personal goal is to get the sheep scream into everything possible. And I've heard it in a couple other things out there in the world. And I don't know if it's because someone else had the same idea or someone else heard it in a dumb internet video I did or what. I don't want to take credit for it, but my lifelong campaign, on the down low is trying to get the sheep scream to be the next Wilhelm. But I only use it for humans. That's the thing. I only use it for humans. It's never actually used for sheep.
Do you have like your own name for the sound, or is it just kind of like what folder it's in, and you just
it's just the sheep scream. It's just the YouTube rip of the sheep scream, and I really should cut it down to a mono track and trim it and clean it up. But yeah.
We have a question from Viking. Kevin, what's the most challenging scene that you've ever designed?
Ooh, that's a really good question. I think, quite honestly, stuff that's really subtle, I often find to be the most difficult, where, you're really trying to be efficient and minimal. So the stuff that I find the most challenging is oftentimes when you're trying to do something like Foley for a documentary, and it's an emotional scene, but they really need to have Foley to make the B-roll work. I worked on one called, I'm blanking on the name. It was about ballroom dancing though. Is it Walk, Run, Cha Cha? I'll have to double check. But it's this older married couple that do dancing sort of as their creative expression kind of on the side, and they're otherwise fairly unexciting people, you would assume. But it was something like that for a documentary. We decided we needed some effects work to go with a story of them talking about their journey to come to the United States because they were immigrants. And it was about escaping, from war. And it was trying to come up with something that was really pretty authentic, because you don't want to take it too far, something like that. So I often find it's the really invisible stuff that's the most difficult.
That's really interesting.
And it might just be because, I like big old, goofy, loud movies, kind of, grew up thinking that stuff was really cool, and kind of got started doing really heavy action stuff. To me, that's a little more easy because you can go big to find your tone and to find the place you want. But I think when you need to be more delicate, it's not necessarily more difficult, but it's much more mindful because you have so few elements to work with to really nail it.
Yeah, it's almost like some people out there, not sound people probably, who think that, a quiet place is easier to sound design than, Godzilla. It's really interesting to hear your perspective about that.
Yeah, background editing. I always have imposter syndrome when it's about cutting backgrounds. I'll be cutting like the fifth layer of this room tone. Like, I don't know, but it's just like, it's the weirdest thing to get hung up on, but I feel it's just like, yeah. Does this really sound like the air of a room of this size?
What does air sound like? We have a question from Sam for that fight scene. I think this is from the London Brawling first one. Yeah. Were you doing all of that Foley at home? Do you create a lot of those whooshes yourself, or mostly modify from library sound effects?
Yeah, for that first one, we were fortunate where that's a lot of production sound. And that really kind of gives you half the Foley bed. And again, because it's so quick, it's sort of turn up the music and hope you don't have to Foley too much. Generally, for something like that, because it's such a stylized thing, the whooshes are pretty much built from library. But then a lot of the more specific cloth movements, I'll just record to picture at that time into a laptop and just kind of do a couple passes on it and cut it in real quick.
Very nice.
Sort of path of least resistance, to the result.
Yeah. We have a question from Juan, and I actually want to partly answer this, but I definitely want to leave it to you as well. Juan asks, do you know where can we learn tips or tricks to create? What are your references? And before you answer, Kevin, I just want to say, this is kind of a meta thing to say, but Kevin used to have a YouTube series
Oh no.
that you can find online. Sorry to put you on the spot, but this YouTube series, strangely enough, is called Sound Advice. Not at all affiliated with the MPSC or anything that we're doing here, but I thought it was so funny that you used to do that. And you had some great tutorials back in the day that are still, I think, on YouTube, Juan. So if anyone's interested in learning Kevin's tips and tricks directly, he did a lot of, so at least a few tutorial videos. But yeah, what would you recommend, Kevin, in terms of like people learning tips and tricks to create sounds?
Yeah, I mean, and this might be coming from me being a person that just likes to kind of, get their hands dirty and make mistakes. A lot of it, I think, is really just that. A question I get a lot from people who are earlier on in their careers, it's, related demo reels. And then I have a couple that are unfortunately still on the internet, like my original demos I did. But I found, when I was starting out, a lot of the projects I was on, I wasn't really happy with as overall bigger picture, projects. They weren't, I felt like the best examples of what I thought I could do. So I took just a couple short movie clip scenes, like cinematics from video games or whatever, and then completely redid the audio from scratch. And that's a really good way to test yourself and try to learn a specific genre or whatever. If you want to, try to do giant robots, just take a scene from something that has them and completely rebuild it. And then, if you're at the point in your career where that would be a beneficial demo, you're kind of killing two birds with one stone. So I think at that point, it's kind of a no risk thing. You can really challenge yourself by recreating sound as something that, has a, $250 million budget, and you can see, can you push yourself to produce stuff on that level? And then again, if you're happy with it enough at the end, you can use that to hopefully solicit some attention to, your skill set. But I think at that point, for your own personal growth and also just for finding, gigs, it's great to sort of shoot for the job you want to have instead of necessarily showing just stuff you've already done. I think the one really important thing, in my opinion, when I'm like watching other people's demos, is it's really, even if you want to just be a quote unquote sound designer, really make that a fully filled demo. Like do it as if they said, we're not going to have music in the scene, like really fill everything in, cut backgrounds, cut Foley, add in vocal efforts if you can, if the scene seems like it wants it. Because it's hard not to have listeners kind of look, gravitate to what's not there. It's like, why is the scene so quiet? The sound effects are good, but it seems like there's something missing here. It's worth putting in the extra effort if you're gonna show it. And if it really feels like if it really feels complete, I think that shows a lot for your sense of storytelling. Even if it goes beyond what you'd want to be doing.
Absolutely. I remember back in the day, this is probably pretty early in your career, but you did one for a Zelda cutscene.
Oh yeah.
That was pretty fun. I don't know if that's still up online anywhere.
It's still there.
We had a question from Tina. My dad was an old-time sound effects editor. I worked with him for a few years, and what I recall is that his library was essential. That cataloging it was a pain, and he rarely used one sound for a sound. The big beam that hit Richard Crenna's head in Body Heat was made of about 5 different sounds: watermelons, pillows, etc. He was a 35mm guy. How do you manage your library now?
I mean, nowadays it's all just through software, SoundMiner or Basshead or whatever, and that makes it a little more manageable because it just gives you sort of a way to search and a way to directly import it. I will openly admit that I went for a pretty good amount of time without having that luxury, and I was just using Windows file browser, and I got very fast at it using VLC player to preview stuff. There are massive disadvantages. You can't see the waveform. You can't import parts of files. You have to make sure Pro Tools is set to copy, instead of just link file. But I think just as you spend time with it, you build up a personal mental catalog of things, and it becomes more of, oh, what was that thing called? Like you already will know what you want, and it's just digging through to find it.
We have a question from Mark. Mark says, I'm 55 years old. After 15 years of sound editing hiatus, just began to relearn Pro Tools. It'll be another 6 months or so before I get back up to speed. However, I got sidetracked and I'm learning video editing simultaneously. DaVinci Resolve. How is the current job market for strictly sound editors? One would think there are so many productions that the job market would be robust. Should I continue to learn both video and sound editing or stick with just one?
In my personal opinion, I think, especially in film, learning about things that are beyond what you might necessarily be doing is always good. Like, I think the most talented people, I feel like, in film, sound and otherwise, are always these weird closeted talented people. Like, every person I know who's a good DP ends up being like an amazing singer or an amazing sound editor or an amazing sculptor or something. And I think just in general being curious about things is really useful. And in the more practical standpoint, a lot of people are starting to cut stuff in DaVinci Resolve, and there are issues with the AAFs that I've at least been seeing. So there's some practical benefits to being familiar with the program as well, as far as troubleshooting.
Yeah.
But
yeah, go ahead, Kevin. Sorry.
No, I was gonna say, just I think because we're all so dependent on so few programs. I think having a basic understanding of as many of them as possible is really useful. Like, for a good while, I had Premiere. I taught myself After Effects kind of for fun for a little while, and they're not directly useful skills, but I think it's definitely given me a lot more insight and helped me troubleshoot on collaborative projects when there's a problem coming from another program.
We have a question from Antonis. Any sound design and mixing considerations for web content specifically, as opposed to broadcast TV or film?
It's a lot looser. And every few months, I kind of go back online and try to check and see if anyone's sold on a standard. These days, I generally just try to keep my overall loudness at -14 or a little below it. If it naturally wants to be a little quieter than that, there's no problem. That's very loud. And then I've these days just been setting a true peak limiter at -2. And I just tend to try to look at all the major web platforms, find who's the strictest, and then conform to that, because it's hard to say what's going to happen to your file if you're a lot hotter than that. It's if YouTube decides to change their audio system and it automatically pulls down stuff that's above a certain threshold or whatever. I can't say personally that's how it works. But back in the earlier days, as in like the first video, the London Brawling bit for sure, I think that was literally just like a limiter and just no metering. It was just like, hey, this is the internet, guys. Let's just, if the mix sounds good, we'll release it. Which is absolutely wild, but grossly irresponsible. But I guess the result sounds okay,
I think pretty great still. Juan asks, please tell us the big secret. How do you make sound effects sound big sound effects sound bigger, cinematic, and powerful?
Ooh, I mean, especially I think coming from something where everything was so loud, it's really more about, more than literal loudness. It's a lot of sort of the rhythm and pacing. Of course, an obvious one is contrast. If you can have silence before a big event, then obviously that'll hit stronger. I think the other thing is the duration, and it's really kind of considering the punctuation of the event. Stuff that's so loud for us in real life, like loud, like stuff like gunshots, they always sound wimpy. And I think it's because I think the way Ben Burt put it is, gunshots should be 2 syllables. So it's like a kablam. And it's really kind of stretching it that way. Especially working, for stuff that was going to be played on the web, you're always so loud. That was a very common frustration where it's just, this, our dialogue's been like practically at the limiter the whole time. How are we gonna make any of these effects hit? And I think it's a lot of it's also considering your mix. If you are in the position where you can dip the music for a quarter of a second, that's definitely a valid tool, at least in a crushed stereo mix.
Yeah. I think, Kevin, if you're okay with it, we should tell a story about a little time when I worked at EA and you came and recorded some sounds at EA.
Sure.
So I'll just start it and then I'll leave it to you. I was working at EA at the time in marketing, sound designing trailers for games for BioWare, and we were working on a live action Mass Effect trailer that premiered E3 2011. And there were some characters in the game called Husks, which I think that was the name, and they were like these alien zombie characters. And we were missing some vocals for those characters. And I was working in an office at EA in Playa Vista, and the rest I'll leave to you.
Well, I guess this goes back to the having multiple interests is always beneficial when you're in a creative industry. And when I was going to USC, I was living at my parents' house to save costs, but it was like a 25-mile drive one way. So I spent a long time in LA traffic, and I decided for some reason to just teach myself like extreme metal screaming, which is a very dumb idea, but it was something to do in the car while I was angry at traffic. So yeah, we just had a good time in your office, yelling as loud as possible for like an hour. And I remember we got a lot of looks from people coming by, but it was, we had to get the trailer done. We didn't have the game assets, and they may not have been appropriate anyway for the live action. And when it was all cut together, they're in there for like 2 seconds. So, but it was worth it. It was a good experience.
It was great. I mean, I remember that day really well, and it was just fun working with you and you coming in and just going for it, just screaming at the top of your lungs in an office where people are walking by in the hallway, going to, the kitchen for coffee in the morning or whatever. And we kept a lot of that stuff in the trailer. I do remember.
Well, that's become one of the things that I can do. So if I ever get a zombie project, I'll usually just be like, "Hey guys, I got it." We're good. So,
since working on projects such as Video Game High School, what have you heard from aspiring or younger sound editors who grew up listening to your work at this point?
Yeah, I think the most surreal thing for me is the work I did when I was the least experienced in a way has had the biggest impact on the audience, in the sense that people who grew up with that are now entering the industry. Like stuff I've done later that's more respectable. Hopefully those people will enter the industry at some point. But what's wild is, we were just kind of having fun and trying to, figure out what this new platform was. But I'm finding for a lot of people who are getting into film, YouTube was like a big source of inspiration rather than necessarily being conventional TV or conventional cinema. So there's a lot of people that I think saw, fun shorts on the internet. And I think one of the big things that had an impact was a lot of those YouTube videos had behind the scenes. So it was really kind of making that process relatively transparent and letting people see the creators. And I think I've heard from people where it really resonated that they were able to see, young people, a really diverse group of people working together to make, something that they really enjoyed watching. So it's absolutely surreal to have been, part of something that's, cats and RC cars and CGI gunshots being the reasons that, part of the reason some people got really interested in film. But, that's how it is. I feel like I should be the last person to judge the platform, but it's just like, wow. We
have a question from Shalini. Hey, Kevin, what are some of the best ways to get in touch with independent filmmakers and video creators, I guess, in the current era now?
Yeah, in a way, it's a little hard to say just because I haven't looked for new work directly, all that much recently, just because I've been fortunate enough to sort of picked up the momentum where it's, friends of friends kind of thing. But that being said, there's a lot of people active. For me personally, I've seen on Twitter. It tends to lean a little more video game industry, but it's such a crowded market. But I think it's worth maintaining a social media page, at least as a way to kind of put your name out there and declare, what kind of work you're interested in doing. There's a great sound editor from LA on Instagram named Vanessa Flores, who has a good kind of breakdown of how she got her Instagram channel to pick up. And that's, I think what's nice is a lot of people on the social media platforms, who are using it professionally or at least semi-professionally, they'll still post their hot takes about Book of Boba Fett or whatever. But, they tend to be pretty generous and, try to help people out and kind of, everyone's kind of trying to crack that question together. How do we communicate, especially post-pandemic? How do we figure this out?
Yeah, that seems like it's a whole different rabbit hole at this point, post-pandemic networking. Is there anything that you wish you knew when you first came out of school that you think might have helped you early on in your career?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't mean to sound arrogant, but in a way, no, because I feel like personally I learned the best from getting it wrong, and I feel like that's the best way to learn. I think I was fortunate in that I found the early YouTube stuff to be pretty creatively fulfilling. So I felt like I had ownership of my mistakes, and I didn't feel like I was necessarily hitting a wall where I wasn't allowed to do something. If anything, it might have been nice to have known a little more about delivery standards and mixing. And those were, opportunities, I certainly had a chance to dabble in film school, but really having a little more heads up. But at the same time, I was delivering to a platform where, the standard was set by someone uploading a video of them at the zoo. So it was all over the place.
Did you ever think about, like, at any point in your career, like, think about going the more traditional route, like going a union job at a studio, or even like at a bigger game studio, getting a job like that?
Yeah, I certainly on and off have always been like, did I make the right choice? But I think ultimately I got into film without having a really specific objective goal. I knew I liked working with people who were talented and had interesting ideas and would let me contribute. And I know that's such a vague romantic notion, but I've really kind of just been chasing that and just kind of letting it take me into different things. And then, when someone comes along that I can collaborate with, who I'm a fan of, and I've heard of their work or something, that's always a really nice bonus. But certainly if I'm having a bad week or times where work slows down, it's like, man, should I have not done this? But ultimately, no, I'm content with the path, because I don't know where it's going to go yet. And what I like about it is I don't know.
That's pretty cool. You talked a little bit about just like the people that have now grown up on some of your work. Have you noticed any big shifts in the industry based on the types of videos you worked on, whether it be like stylistic approach or the types of people that are interested in becoming sound editors now?
In terms of, you mean like types of works as in, can you elaborate there?
Yeah. I guess like have like the earlier projects that you worked on, like the web shorts, the super, high concept, like visual effects heavy short form stuff, the way that you approach it, do you feel like that has influenced like projects that are out there in the wild and the way that sound editors work?
Oh, I mean, I feel like I'd be the worst person to actually give you an opinion on that, because for me, whatever I do is just what made sense at the time, and I can't think of it any other way. But again, I think just one thing that's been really nice is hearing from different people. It always meant something to them, no matter how, silly or whatever the content, may appear to be. If it didn't hit you at that right age, it's just interesting seeing how, regardless of budget or whatever the platform is, if there's, a story that's told in an entertaining way, people really connect to it. Go ahead. I was thinking, another thing I found interesting is a question I get a lot is whether I've found the industry difficult in terms of discrimination. And I was in this fortunate position where the groups I worked with were always really diverse. And I feel like more than half the sound editors that I keep in touch with and work with are women or minorities. So I personally haven't seen it, but I think it's it's interesting just hearing from people where that made a big impact on them, seeing YouTube creators of different backgrounds all uploading material to this platform and kind of being in a way a more sort of democratized space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wonder how different it would have been if we came out of school 20, 30 years ago. But I think back to your point about your videos and why they connected with people, like the early rocket jump and that kind of stuff. Like, to me, it seems like you all just put a lot of your heart and soul and just like love into these projects. Like, you didn't do it because you were trying to make make a paycheck and go home. Like, you all put a lot of extra time and love into your work.
Yeah, I mean, it was the turnouts were so quick, you couldn't do anything less than all in,
Yeah.
But it was weird because, again, that was before, that was such sort of a fluid time for the platform. So on like some of those videos, like John Favreau is in one of them because he liked it and he put one of the Freddy W videos in Chef, I think, on like someone's phone. Key and Peele were in like another one. It was this thing of like people were waiting to see what it blew up into, and I don't think there's a clear answer. I still don't know what happened, but like it's still sort of happening and it's sort of diverged into other directions. It's just I feel like nowadays the best observation I've heard is if people were to do short films, like we were doing back then, it'd probably be TikTok now. Like, it's just the platforms keep changing, but I think fundamentally, people's desire to pursue these wacky passion projects is still there, of course.
Yeah, it seems like TikTok would make a lot more sense than like an Instagram reel or something. We have a question from Jetty. How do you stay in touch with your sound peers?
Yeah, especially these days, right?
Yeah.
I barely leave the house and I'm watching some kids. So it's a lot of it is unfortunately through social media these days. If someone has something come out, they'll post about it, or I'll text or video call with people these days. But I try my best to keep in touch with people outside of, hey, I need another editor, But that is always sort of the struggle. But I think it's kind of because it's universal. I feel like people are pretty forgiving these days.
We have a question from Viking. What is the strangest Foley you've ever done?
Oh, well, I'm working on a video game right now. I don't know if it's the strangest, but I did straight up have to tell the whole team, all right, I'm turning around this material. It's a full motion video game. So I'm doing about 10 hours of like footage, and it's processing it to fit the narrative. A bunch of sex scenes. So it was just like, all right, just so you know, I did Foley all the sex scenes. And it was more of just like, not that I was personally doing anything that was particularly objectionable, but it was just sort of like, I have this open on a screen and the kids could walk in at any time. I was like, what are you doing? It's like, well,
That's really funny. That sounds like an interesting project too, just overall.
Yeah, and the performing it, because it's just getting skin, so you're obviously not using any censorship worthy parts of your body or anything, but it's really the editing on that where you start to question your sanity.
Right. I mean, there have been obviously sex scenes in films in years past that I'm sure are Foleyed differently than the actual, the real way.
It's probably the same thing, yeah.
A question from Sam, more of a mixed question. To hit -14 with a -2 true peak, do you prefer to mix into the limiter, or do you like to mix with more headroom and then do a mastering pass at the end?
I mean, it really depends. For web, the demands are usually, the time constraints are usually so intense. And I know we're allowed to go loud. I usually just kind of go for it and just check. It really is by ear. I do want to put out that is kind of unique to web content. Obviously if I'm doing something that's like a broadcast commercial, I will not mix it that way. Like, whoa. We'll, definitely level it out, and then we'll do a second pass to kind of get it to sit where it needs to. But I found for the web stuff, I'll just kind of start pretty hot and then sort of live there the whole time. And then usually I'll really be bringing down volume globally, 1 or 2 dB, if like a loud moment doesn't play right, if it starts feeling too squashed. And it's really just by ear of, if I'm feeling it hitting the limiter a lot, if it's starting to feel compressed, then it's too loud. That's really the means by which I make that decision.
And are you typically working on headphones from home?
Yeah. Just working on the good old Sonys. So it's just what I'm used to. So, other brands are just as good, but I'm just used to them. So
yeah, I feel like that's what they recommended back in film school that we used. And they're great.
I've stuck with them since. So I'm still on my first pair. I've never had to replace them. It's just like my 5th or 6th set of ear pads.
Oh, wow. A question from Juan. Which loudness standard do you follow in video game mixing?
For video games, my role has always been pretty limited. Like, I've done asset creation. I haven't really done implementation or handling the whole overall dynamic mix. Or for something like the full motion video game, where I'm just delivering sort of static pre-baked audio assets that will live with other things. It's really just a project by project determination. I'll always refer to someone else on what's the loudness, what should it be.
That makes sense. And what kinds of projects are you working on? I mean, you talked about a couple of things you're working on right now, but just in general, what sorts of projects are you working on these days? Like, where did all this early stuff in your career sort of lead you to?
Yeah, I'm still on YouTube, for better and worse, but it's mostly for music videos these days. I work with a really interesting director named Mike Diva, who I did a YouTube video with, and then of course now he did one of Lil Nas X's videos. He did a Doja Cat video, and I'm like the sound guy he knows. So that's still sort of the same workflow. I have an indie film coming up that's shot by some people I know from YouTube. And then, all the video game projects I'm in, it's either producers or other YouTube creators that have, crossed into other zones. So it all kind of goes back to YouTube one way or the other, but.
Very cool. Any last things you want to touch on that you feel like, young sound editors can learn from based on your career path?
Yeah, I mean, kind of at risk of repeating myself, I think just because things are becoming, relatively speaking, more and more accessible, I always just say, don't get caught up on even necessarily learning a specific piece of software. If you have something that will let you cut, picture or sound, just start doing it. Don't worry about, at that point in your career, I have to be very clear, this is before you are delivering anything to a client. At that point in your career, don't really worry about copyright. Just get comfortable with the process, get comfortable with making creative decisions, figuring out what your taste is, figuring out what you're good at, what you want to develop. Another thing I have not personally used, but there's more and more subscription-based sound libraries available online, and some of them seem like they're getting quite robust, into the hundreds of thousands of available assets. There might be someone in the chat here who can confirm that or recommend any, but compared to even when we were getting started, the barrier to entry is getting lower. So I think the most important thing is just getting the actual practical experience.
Absolutely. We'll do one final audience question here before we go. Juan asks, how do you obtain the inspiration before you start on a project?
I think it's just being honest with myself about my reaction to it. And, if I'm fortunate enough where it's a really good project, I'll kind of watch it with, the crappy temp effects, and then I'll just start hearing things. And then it's just trying to capture start laying down something in the session before it gets away from me. And then if it's something that isn't really working, it's kind of taking a step back and being like, what do I think they're trying to do? with this piece? Why is the scene not working? And then try to figure out how you can add in things that would improve that. But a lot of times for me, it's specifics that jump out first. Like if I'm getting really excited about, a project, I get the vibe of it. It'll just be like, oh, this moment here could use something. And I think I have an idea. And I sort of let the chaos happen up front, and I start planning things. And then, from there, at a certain point, you try to organize. But I think it's just not thinking about too much, honestly, which sounds a bit counterintuitive, but just react to it and lean into that.
So it sounds like getting as quickly from the idea phase to actually creating something and trying it out is super important for you.
Yeah, sometimes it isn't always the case, but sometimes I'll really go down the rabbit hole and just design like one or two specific cues, and then I have to get the rest of the project to catch up with it. But sometimes that makes sense if there's a specific challenge. Like on one of the features I have coming up, we know there's going to be one really big specific sound design challenge, and that I've been trying to temp out and prototype, but can't go too far until I see something. But in other times it'll be a random, fairly simple cue, but if it inspires me to try to cut something, I'll try to do it as quickly as possible.
Very nice. Well, Kevin, I just want to say thank you. This has been really great to talk with you like this. I've learned a bit, and I hope that everyone out there has as well. And I just really appreciate you taking the time to talk with everyone tonight.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Of course. Thank you all for coming. We have plenty of other MPSE sound advice events coming up, so please stay tuned to our MPSE website and social media. And we hope we'll see you at the next event.